The day after Thanksgiving in Washington, Mandy Stavik laced up her running shoes and headed out for a jog with her dog Kira. It was a route she knew well, one she'd run countless times before, but 2 hours later, Kira came home alone. The dog's tail was tucked, her body trembling. It was the kind of silent alarm that hits you in the gut before your brain can even process it. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. Within hours, more than 500 volunteers and law enforcement officers were out searching, calling her name, combing through woods and water, hoping for a miracle. 3 days later, that hope shattered. Mandy was found floating in the river, her only attire being running shoes and socks. The autopsy revealed she'd been knocked unconscious, then put into the cold water, where she had drowned. One local resident later recalled turning to a friend and saying, almost instinctively, "I'm sure I know who did this." And as unbelievable as it sounds, just 3 months later, a half-finished cup of coffee would help confirm a name that had lingered in the background for nearly 3 decades. Before I dive further into this story, don't forget to subscribe and let me know where you're watching. I always love seeing the places you all tune in. From Detective Kevin Bowie remembered the exact sound of the knock that morning, his own, echoing lightly as he stepped into Sheriff Bill Elfo's office. "You called for me?" Kevin asked. The sheriff's eyes met his, serious and steady. "I've got a gift for you, Bowie," he said, sliding a thin manila folder across the desk. The moment Kevin touched it, he knew. For nearly 30 years, the case of Mandy Stavik wasn't just another file for him. She'd been a friend, a bright, driven young woman whose life had been taken far too soon. Her story had stayed with him, close to the heart, like a promise he refused to let go. He took the folder back to his office and closed the door. As he sat down, the hum of the fluorescent lights faded to nothing. His usually rock-steady hands shook as he opened the report. Inside was the DNA analysis they'd waited on for 3 long months, the samples taken quietly from Tim Bass while at work. One word pulled his eyes in and wouldn't let go. The air seemed to collapse around him. He inhaled sharply as decades of determination finally met the truth. Tears came, unexpected, unstoppable. After all this time, they had him Mandy's killer. He reached for Mandy's original case file, its cover softened and worn from years of study. As he opened it again, it felt like the pages carried him back, not just to the crime, but to the vibrant girl Mandy had been. Mandy Stavik was born on April 16, 1971, in Bellingham, Washington, to Mary and Glenn Stavik. The family moved up to Palmer, Alaska shortly after her birth, but after her parents divorced 3 years later, Mary packed up with 3 of her children, Molly, Mandy, and Lee, and moved to the tiny community of Acme, Washington. And tiny is no exaggeration. In 1974, Acme had fewer than 350 people, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and probably what they were having for dinner. Mandy quickly made a name for herself at Mount Baker High School. She was one of those students teachers still talk about years later. One teacher recalled that Mandy wanted to do well in everything she did, and it showed. She threw herself into music, playing flute, clarinet, and saxophone. She learned sign language. She spoke Japanese. She earned top grades, and she didn't stop there. She played basketball, cheered, rode horses, played softball, and ran track with a passion everyone noticed. Her sister Molly described her as larger than life, someone who seemed to accomplish more in 18 years than some do in 40. Her basketball coach was more than just a coach to her. He became a reliable mentor during a time when she needed stability. She once wrote him a card saying, "To Mr. Freeman, the one person who has inspired me and influenced me more than anyone, thank you. You're the greatest." Signed, Mandy Stavik, class of '89, number 13. She was the sort of young woman people admired by instinct, easygoing, diligent, clever. Her mother, Mary, once almost said in wonder, "I don't know how I managed to have that child." In 1989, Mandy finished high school with dreams of being a commercial airline pilot and had begun courses at Central Washington University that Thanksgiving. She'd come home to visit. On November 25th, she went for a run, her usual 5-mile stretch from the house to the Nooksack River and back. She frequently did it every day when she was living at home. Her brother Lee happened to be at a friend's place that afternoon. From the window, he saw her running on her way back, one of the last people to see her alive. She never made it home. About 2 hours after she had left, Kira, their faithful German shepherd, came back alone, shaking. Kira's tail was tucked tight when she came home, an unmistakable sign that something was terribly wrong. The moment Mandy's mother Mary saw the dog trembling at the door, panic set in. Mandy was steady as a metronome in her routines, and Kira never returned without her. Something was off, dangerously off. Mary began calling anyone she could think of. First, Mandy's boyfriend, Rick. He hadn't heard from her. Then other friends, family members, anyone who might have seen her. Within hours, a search was underway. Volunteers, deputies, bloodhounds. Everyone was out there looking. Still, deep down, Mary feared the worst at first. Everyone tried to hang on to hope. Maybe Mandy had twisted an ankle. Maybe she'd taken shelter somewhere. But after the first 24 hours passed with no trace of her, reality began to sink in. If she'd only been injured, someone would have found her. The silence was too loud to ignore. Investigators immediately started talking to the people closest to Mandy. Her boyfriend Rick was at the top of the list. They dated on and off through high school and had both come home from college for the holiday. He cooperated fully, had a solid alibi, and was quickly cleared. Another lead came from a man who'd seen her running past his parked truck on her way home. Sadly, that sighting only confirmed what the timeline already suggested. She'd been almost home when something terrible happened. Search teams combed back roads on day 2 and located a pair of green sweatpants. Mandy had been wearing green sweatpants that day. But after forensic testing, they couldn't be definitively linked to her. Just one more frustrating dead end in a sea of them. On the third day, detectives took a boat out onto the Nooksack River. That's when they spotted her. Mandy's body was floating in a shallow stretch of water. She was clad only in her running shoes and socks. It was a gut punch, and it raised questions immediately. This part of the river was shallow. Mandy was an excellent swimmer, and there were no signs of a struggle on the rocks below. Something about it didn't add up. An injury on Mandy's head confirmed investigators' fears that she had been knocked unconscious before entering the water. She hadn't fallen in. She'd been placed there. Detectives removed her body as carefully as possible, hoping to preserve every bit of evidence. In the autopsy, they found male DNA semen proving Mandy had been sexually assaulted before she was killed. As investigators pieced together what was most likely to have happened, they believed her attacker used a vehicle because Mandy was too fast to be caught on foot. They theorized he'd pointed a gun at her, forced her inside, and kicked Kyra into a ditch before speeding away. They believed he drove her about 3.5 miles away to a blackberry field where the assault occurred. Mandy had scratches all over her arms and legs, consistent with someone in a desperate attempt to run through dense, thorny brambles trying to escape. He caught her, struck her in the head, and afterward put her unconscious body into the river, where she drowned. Meanwhile, detectives pursued every lead, and the town gathered for a memorial service. About 1,000 were in attendance, huge for a small town like Acme. Mandy's basketball coach, Jim Freeman, gave the eulogy, his voice somber with the weight of a mentor mourning a young woman who had meant so much to so many. Acme had always been a peaceful place, doors left unlocked, neighbors you trusted without a second thought. Mandy's murder cracked that sense of safety wide open. People were scared, people were angry, and people wanted answers. Tips poured in, most centered around a local drifter named David, whom many already found suspicious. Detectives interviewed him, got a warrant for his DNA, and compared it to the sample recovered from Mandy. No match. Another lead gone. Investigators collected saliva samples from roughly 30 local men. Still nothing matched. And without more evidence, the case slowly slipped into cold case limbo. Years later, when Kevin Bowie became lead detective in 2009, Mandy's case was the first one he pulled. He pored over every page, every scrap of information. One name stuck out, John Wisniewski, a local drug dealer who, back in '89, had allegedly bragged that he knew who killed Mandy. In 2010, Bowie made the long trip all the way to Cambodia, where Wisniewski was residing, to question him. But when pressured, the man would say only one phrase: "I don't know." Bowie could practically feel the lies hanging in the air, but without evidence, he couldn't push further. The lead fizzled. 3 more years passed. Then, in June 2013, the unexpected happened. A new lead materialized, not because of forensic science, and not from a witness, but from the most unlikely of situations. A casual conversation between two moms at a water park. Their names were Heather Backstrom and Marilee Anderson. Both had attended Mount Baker High School, just like Mandy, and that day they happened to take their kids to the Birch Bay water slides. It was really just a coincidence that Heather and Marilee even crossed paths that day. They'd gone to the same high school, sure, but they barely knew each other back then. Now, years later, they were sitting in the grassy area at a water park, watching their kids splash around, chatting with a few other moms. As is often the case with small towns, old stories were brought up, and one of the mothers mentioned a case well known by everyone from Mount Baker High and the town of Acme, the murder of Mandy Stavik. "I just can't believe we still don't know who did this," she said. That case had hung over the town for decades, reshaping what used to be an easy sense of safety. And then, out of nowhere, Heather spoke up. "I know who killed her." The other moms froze. Before anyone could react, Marilee added quietly, "I do too." Two women who'd barely spoken in high school, yet both had separately come to suspect the same man. Both had experiences with him that left them uneasy, which they'd never reported because small towns have long memories, and accusing someone without proof can turn your life upside down. They were also genuinely scared of him. The man they both named was Tim Bass, who had also attended Mount Baker High. He was even a friend of Marilee's husband, which made speaking up even more complicated. Marilee spoke first. It had happened a couple of years after Mandy's murder. She was home alone with her baby. Her husband was out of town for work. Late one evening, Tim showed up at her door. She listened to the beep, beep, beep of numbers dialed, but the phone call wasn't connecting. It was evident that he had pretended to make a call as an excuse to get inside. Her fear spiked immediately. Tim walked straight through her kitchen and into her bedroom, calling out to her, "I used to drive by your house. I've always been in love with you. I want to make love to you." Marilee was terrified. Her husband was gone. She was home with an infant, and Tim refused to leave. She kept telling him no, but he kept trying to convince her to come into the bedroom. It wasn't until she threatened to call the police that he finally left. She said that when the door closed behind him, she felt an overwhelming sense of relief. When Marilee finished her story, Heather shared her own experience, one that happened just several months before Mandy was murdered. At the time, Heather was 15 and Tim was 21. She, Tim, and a young man named Dan, her friend then, her husband later, had gone to a softball game together. Afterwards, Dan drove them to a Dairy Queen. They sat in a pickup truck with a classic three-seat bench across the front. Dan driving, Heather in the middle. Tim on the passenger side. Heather was wearing cut-off denim shorts. Tim began flirting in a way that wasn't just uncomfortable. It was downright inappropriate. He told her how beautiful her eyes were, then took a pen and slowly rubbed it along her bare legs. Heather felt completely unnerved, but she didn't want to cause a scene. She figured Dan's presence would keep things from going any further. But that moment stayed with her, especially when Mandy was murdered just a few months later. Something in her gut just told her the two were connected. That night, after the water park conversation, Marilee went home and acted on the fear and suspicion she'd held on to for years. She called a friend who worked at the Whatcom County Sheriff's Office and told him everything. Her experience, Heather's experience, and her belief that Tim Bass might have been involved in Mandy's death. That call finally set a formal investigation in motion, and incredibly, until then, almost 20 years after the murders, Tim Bass had never once been questioned. Not him, not his brother Tom, not their father. It was strange since Tim lived on the same street as Mandy. She practically ran by his house almost every day. His family was well-liked, though, respected, and sometimes in small, tight-knit communities, the goodwill acts like a shield. For 20 years after the murder, Tim lived what appeared to be a normal life. 6 weeks after Mandy was murdered, he married a woman named Gina, who'd also attended Mount Baker High. They settled in Everson, about 19 miles from Acme. Tim worked as a delivery driver for the Franz Bakery outlet. He and Gina had 3 kids. But behind closed doors, things were far from normal. When detectives first contacted Gina, before speaking to Tim or his family, she was open about their marriage. She said that she'd married him partly to escape her own unstable home, but life with Tim quickly became its own kind of prison. He controlled everything: what she wore, who she could talk to, and what she could do. She said he treated her more like a servant than as a partner, constantly ordering her to do things like, "Go get me a drink," or "Go get me food." When investigators later interviewed Tim's brother Tom, he confirmed it. He'd heard Tim tell Gina to shut up more times than he could count. Gina had lived in fear for almost 30 years, not out of love, but intimidation. Gina once tried to leave Tim. She stayed away for 2 months and got a restraining order. But when she started divorce proceedings, Tim threatened her, saying he'd lie to the courts and make sure she'd never see their children again. Terrified of losing them, she felt she had no choice but to return. She also told investigators something that sent a chill through the room. Tim would often watch crime shows, especially ones covering Mandy's murder. And while watching, he'd shake his head, saying things like how stupid the killer was and how he didn't cover his tracks. Sometimes he'd even remark, almost casually, that he wouldn't be surprised if the murderer eventually got caught. To Gina, that was eerie beyond words. The man making those comments, she knew, was the very man who had committed that crime. Detectives also interviewed Tim's brother Tom. He characterized Tim as a loner, someone who never appeared comfortable around people. He remembered an unsettling incident from high school. Tim's girlfriend broke up with him over the phone, and while still on the call, Tim held a pistol and said, "I'm going to kill myself." Then he shot the gun into the air. Tom said that was the moment something changed. After that, Tim became openly hostile toward women. Disgust, disrespect, a deep bitterness. Tom's wife, Robin, noticed it too. She once said that Tim acted as though women just weren't equal, like we were living in a whole different century. Tim's boss at Fran's Bakery, Kim Wagner, had her own firsthand experience. She says Tim refused to call her by her name, ever. He addressed her only, she says, as woman. Not exactly the behavior of an employee winning most professional at the holiday party. With information mounting up, detectives finally paid a visit to Tim's house to interrogate him. They asked about Mandy. Tim looked up, faking a memory search. Mandy? He repeated, as if it were some long-forgotten classmate. Detectives weren't buying it. Mandy's murder had rocked the entire town. Anyone who lived in the area at that time knew her story. And Tim lived right on her running route. He absolutely knew who she was. Eventually he said, "Oh yeah, isn't she the girl who was found in the river?" But the forced cluelessness only tightened the detective's certainty. They asked for his DNA, but Tim refused. "I watch all those crime shows," he said. "I see how people go to prison because of their DNA." The detectives didn't press the issue. They didn't want to spook him. Instead, they started thinking about how to get his DNA another way. First, they followed him on his delivery route, hoping he'd toss out a cup or can. But Tim threw away nothing. Next, they stopped by the bakery and talked to his boss, Kim. They were somewhat vague, only stating they were investigating one of her employees. Kim was quite blunt. "He's just a weird dude. You never know what he'll be like." The smallest things set him off. When detectives asked her if she could share his delivery route, she shut that down quickly. "This is way above my pay grade. You'll have to talk to HR." So they went to the corporate office, but corporate wouldn't help without a subpoena or warrant, and detectives still didn't have enough evidence to get one. They eventually came full circle to Kim Wagner. This time she was in a different frame of mind. Since the first and second visitations, she'd been out with friends and mentioned that police had been asking about Tim. One friend said, "Tim Bass? Isn't he the guy who lived on the same street as Mandy?" Kim suddenly realized what this was all about. Everything clicked. The disrespect towards women, the attitude, the anger. Her gut told her the detective's instincts were right. When they returned for the second conversation, she didn't waste time. "Do you want me to get his DNA? Do you want me to find something he's thrown away?" Legally, detectives couldn't ask her to do that. Civilians can't be directed to collect evidence. They could only say carefully, "If you happen to bring us something, we can look at it." And that was all Kim needed. From then on, she watched Tim like a hawk at the bakery. She changed out trash bags all the time, so nothing would get contaminated in case he threw something away. But Tim was careful. Too careful. He wore gloves, didn't leave behind any fingerprints, and took all his trash home with him. For 3 months, he didn't throw out so much as a single cup or can at work. To anyone else, that would be an odd habit. To someone who didn't want DNA collected, it practically screamed guilt. While waiting to see if Kim would be able to get a viable sample, detectives widened their search. They didn't want to fall victim to tunnel vision. They began interviewing more people connected with the case, making sure no stone remained unturned. Goldfogle countered the expert called by the defense by testifying that three factors, the water temperature, Mandy's body temperature at the time of death, and the partial submergence, made it highly improbable that the semen was deposited more than a few hours before Mandy was killed. His testimony strongly supported the prosecution's timeline. Mandy had been attacked, assaulted, and murdered within this narrow time frame. Not over a period of days. He further emphasized the importance of the scratches on Mandy's body. The defense had argued that they were either too minor or unrelated. Dr. Goldfogle explained, however, that their pattern was in concert with a violent struggle Mandy had fought fiercely for her life. Her injuries, he said, were not consistent with consensual sexual activity. They were consistent with defensive wounds. The prosecution underlined Tim Bass's long history of inappropriate behavior towards women, testimony that painted a clear pattern. Gina's accounts, Heather's experience, and Marilee's terrifying encounter all contributed to the portrait of a man who regarded women as objects to be controlled, intimidated, and dominated. The prosecution contended that Mandy had become another target, chosen simply because she jogged past his house. Further supporting this narrative was Tim Bass's own behavior after the murder. Investigators presented evidence of how he repeatedly watched documentaries about Mandy's case, remarking on how stupid the killer was and how he didn't cover his tracks. These comments, prosecutors suggested, were not the cold detachment of a casual viewer. They were the taunts of a man who believed he had committed the perfect crime. In cross-examination, the prosecution deconstructed Tim's tale of a secret affair. There were no witnesses to prove this, no telephone calls, no notes, no sightings, and no evidence of any kind to confirm it. Mandy's family emphatically denied that she would ever have been involved with him. Friends who knew her best said the story was not just unlikely, it was impossible. The notion that Mandy, a popular, disciplined, ambitious college student, had kept a secret, spontaneous, physical relationship with a 22-year-old man she did not socialize with, and who was largely unknown in her circle, lacked believability. The prosecution contended that the affair story was no more than a desperate attempt by Tim Bass to explain away the damning DNA evidence. After weeks of testimony, emotional witness statements, and expert analysis, both sides delivered their closing arguments. The defense insisted that the state had built its case on assumptions, coincidences, and a community's desire for closure. The prosecution countered that every piece of evidence, the DNA, the behavior, the lies, the witnesses, the timeline pointed to one man and one man only. It wasn't until the jury retired to deliberate that the courtroom, full of Mandy's family, friends, and community members who had waited almost 3 decades for justice, fell silent. Hours passed. Then finally the clerk announced that the jury had reached a verdict. The room held its breath as the forepersons stood for the murder of 18-year-old Mandy Stavik, for the kidnapping of Mandy Stavik, for the rape of Mandy Stavik. A quiet gasp rippled through the courtroom. Tears flowed freely, tears of grief, relief, and finally, closure. Mandy's mother, Mary, clasped her hands to her face, overwhelmed. After 28 long years, the man who stole her daughter's life was finally held accountable. Tim Bass showed no emotion. In February 2019, he was sentenced to 27 years in prison, effectively ensuring he would spend the rest of his life behind bars outside the courthouse. Mary Stavik spoke to reporters. Despite the decades of pain and unanswered questions, she displayed a rare grace. "We finally have justice for Mandy," she said softly. "I never thought I'd live to see this day." The community of Acme, forever scarred by the tragedy, breathed its long-awaited sigh of relief. A case that haunted families and friends and an entire town had been solved, not by a sudden confession or a lucky break, but by 2 women finally willing to speak, a dedicated detective, a persistent medical examiner, and a courageous boss who refused to look the other way. It took nearly 3 decades, but Mandy Stavik finally got her justice. The prosecution expert made it clear the evidence showed the semen had been deposited far sooner than 2 days before Mandy's death. His findings lined up with what investigators believed all along, that Mandy had been assaulted, murdered, and then placed in the river. Then Tim's brother Tom took the stand. He remembered how jittery Tim had been immediately after detectives initially requested a DNA sample from him. At the time, Tim had told Tom that he'd supposedly slept with Mandy a few times before she left for college. And again, when she came home for Thanksgiving, Tom said Tim even asked him to lie, claiming he had also slept with Mandy, as if that would somehow make her look less credible. Tom refused. He wasn't willing to twist the truth for his brother. Next up was Tim's wife, Gina. Early on, she had given Tim an alibi, claiming that she was with him all day when Mandy disappeared, and that she even saw Mandy run past their house on the stand. She finally said the truth. She had lied for fear. Now, with Tim behind bars and DNA confirmation of his involvement, she felt safe enough to speak openly. "What do you say to someone like that?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You have to be very careful." I felt like I had to agree with everything he said, because if I didn't, I could be next. Tino Nomont. She explained that she had been young, scared, and controlled, but wished she'd trusted her instincts years earlier. She testified further that Tim had asked his mother to lie for him, and even to blame his father, already deceased. One of Tim's defense attorneys tried to suggest that sometimes innocent people do strange things under pressure. But in this case, that argument felt like a stretch no one in the room could quite believe. Sandra, Tim's mother, also testified. She denied that Tim ever asked her to lie and insisted he'd been a good student, hard-working, and unfairly judged before the trial even began. Despite these claims, however, no person, friend, or relative could corroborate Tim's story that he and Mandy had ever spoken, much less had a relationship. The trial lasted 3 weeks. The jury deliberated just a little over a day, and then, 29 years and 6 months to the day after Mandy Stavik was murdered, 51-year-old Timothy Forrest Bass was found guilty of murder, rape, and kidnapping. 6 weeks later, on July 2, 2019, sentencing began. The courtroom was heavy with nearly 3 decades of grief and waiting. Mandy's mother, Mary, and her sister, Molly, were too heartbroken to speak. Her sister Molly's husband spoke for the family. Timothy Bass must never be allowed to walk the earth as a free person. Never, ever. Then Tim spoke before the court. His voice was flat, calm, almost hollow. "I am 100% innocent of this crime," he stated. "I don't believe I received a fair trial." He added, "The better part of me wants to say very little and give the day to the Stavik family." Bowie watched him closely. To him, it felt like forced humility, another performance. But all that truly mattered now was the judge's final word. And then it came. Tim Bass was sentenced to the maximum, 320 months, just under 27 years. A life sentence hadn't been legally possible, but this was the closest the court could come. For Detective Bowie, it was a tough, hard-won victory justice at last, but still only a fraction of what Mandy deserved. Days later, Bowie sat alone in his office. Mandy's case file, a mountain he had carried for years, was now officially closed. He looked at her high school photo, her bright smile frozen in time, and felt the weight of the journey. The search was over, but the loss, that would never fully fade. Mandy was his friend, forever young, forever running along that road in Acme with her dreams before her. Decades buried in cold files, her story had finally been rebuilt through relentless dedication. 2 courageous mothers, and the truth that DNA brought with it. The reward fund that once sought answers had now turned into a scholarship for Mount Baker High School to help a music student each year, a small piece of Mandy's light continuing into the future. Bowie leaned back in his chair as the office lights softly hummed. The fear that once gripped Acme was gone. The promise he made to himself long ago to bring justice for Mandy was finally kept. The long silence was over, and at last, Mandy Stavik could rest. Thank you for being here and listening. And as always, stay safe, take care of your loved ones, and don't forget to ring the bell for more stories like this.